She started as something that could kill you. She ended up as the reason ancient Egyptians shaved off their eyebrows when their cat died. The journey between those 2 points covers 5,000 years, a complete transformation of divine identity, and one of the most interesting questions in the study of mythology. What does it mean when a god changes? This is Bastet, and almost everything the modern world thinks it knows about her is the last chapter of a much longer story. The earliest evidence for Bastet dates to around 2890 BCE, the second dynasty of Egypt, which means she was already an established deity when the Great Pyramids were still 1,000 years away from being built. She shows up in stone vessel inscriptions from the galleries beneath the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, and in those first appearances she looks nothing like the serene cat-headed figure that fills museum gift shops today. She is a lioness, fully, unambiguously, terrifyingly a lioness. Upright ears, flat feline face, the posture of something that has never in its life been prey. This matters because it shapes everything that follows. The Bastet that Egypt invented at the beginning was not a goddess of hearth and home and gentle protection. She was a war goddess, a guardian of the pharaoh with a specifically violent portfolio. An inscription from the 12th dynasty, a text called the Loyalist Teaching, describes the ideal character of the king this way. He is Bastet who protects the 2 lands, not like Bastet. He is Bastet. The comparison was meant to convey something specific about what a king should be willing to do to his enemies. Nobody was reaching for a cozy metaphor there. To understand what Bastet was in those early centuries, you have to understand the relationship between the lioness and the Egyptian landscape. The Nile Delta in the ancient world was not the heavily populated agricultural zone it eventually became. It was a rich, wild, marshy region with cattle herds, and where there were cattle herds, there were lions. Lionesses in particular were visible and active hunters, coordinating in groups with impressive and observable teamwork. The Egyptians watched them and saw something divine in the combination of ferocity, intelligence, and loyalty to the pride. Several of their most powerful goddesses began as lionesses for exactly this reason. Sekhmet, Mut, Tefnut, Hathor in certain forms, and Bastet, all of them at some point wearing the same face, because the lioness was the shape Egyptian theology reached for when it needed to say, this is what protective power actually looks like. Bastet's divine family reinforced her position at the center of things. She was the daughter of Ra, the sun god, the supreme organizing principle of the Egyptian cosmos. That lineage connected her to the most important divine concept in the entire pantheon, which was the daily journey of the sun across the sky and through the underworld. It also gave her a specific role. She was one of the goddesses designated as the Eye of Ea, a title that meant she could serve as Ra's instrument of action in the world, his enforcer, his weapon when protection required something sharper than light. In one of the older mythological traditions, Bastet stood in Ra's solar bark alongside Thoth and Hathor, helping to beat back Apep, the giant chaos serpent that lurked in the underworld and tried every single night to swallow the sun before it could rise again. This was not a metaphorical assignment. In the Egyptian theological framework, the sun rising every morning was a real daily victory that required divine effort to secure. Bastet was part of that effort. She was working. Her closest divine counterpart was Sekhmet, and the relationship between the 2 of them is one of the more genuinely complex pieces of Egyptian theology. Sekhmet was everything Bastet was at her most ferocious, the lioness goddess of war and plague and divine retribution, the one Ra famously unleashed on humanity when he decided they needed to be punished and then had to stop with beer dyed red to look like blood because she was enjoying herself too much to quit. For a long stretch of Egyptian religious history, Bastet and Sekhmet were essentially 2 aspects of the same divine force, the fierce and the fierce. Both daughters of Ra, both eyes, both lionesses. The Egyptians were comfortable holding 2 versions of a concept simultaneously in a way that tends to make modern categorizing brains slightly anxious. But then something shifted. The shift was slow. It took centuries, and it was driven by something deeply practical. Cats, not lions, had moved into Egyptian homes. By the time of the New Kingdom, domestic cats were established members of Egyptian households. They hunted the rats and snakes that threatened grain stores. They kept disease-carrying vermin out of homes and off food supplies. In an agricultural society where a single bad harvest could mean famine, an animal that quietly protected the food supply was not a pest control solution. It was a guardian. It was sacred. Tomb paintings show Egyptians hunting with their cats, cats sitting under chairs at dinner, cats on leashes. This was a civilization that had decided, collectively and enthusiastically, that cats were something special. Bastet, as the great feline deity, absorbed all of this. Her iconography began to shift. The lion face softened. By around 900 BCE, the transformation was well underway, and by the late period, after 525 BCE, she was consistently depicted as a woman with a cat's head, often carrying a sistrum, a musical rattle used in religious ceremony, and a small basket or aegis. Sometimes she was shown simply as a seated cat, watchful and still, with the characteristic Egyptian ability to make stillness look purposeful rather than passive. As her form changed, her portfolio expanded. She became the protector of the home, of women, of children, of women's secrets specifically, which was a category the Egyptians treated as its own distinct domain. She was associated with fertility, with music, with dance, with pleasure, with the particular kind of safety that belongs to the domestic interior. Perfume and ointment were connected to her name, which may actually derive from the Egyptian word for ointment jar. She was the goddess of the things that made a household, not just functional, but good. Sekhmet stayed a lioness. Bastet became a cat. The two of them settled into a division of divine labor that the Egyptians seemed to find entirely natural. Sekhmet handled plague, war, and the terrifying aspects of solar power. Bastet handled home, joy, and the protective warmth of a life well maintained. In some texts they are described as two faces of the same goddess, the rage that burns and the grace that guards. Two things a cat can be on the same afternoon, frankly. The city of Bubastis, whose name simply means House of Bastet, became her cult center, and eventually, briefly, in the 22nd dynasty, around 943 BCE, the capital of Egypt itself. The pharaoh Shoshenq the first founded his dynasty there and built her a temple that Herodotus, visiting 5 centuries later, called the most beautiful temple in all of Egypt. He described it as sitting on an island formed by 2 channels of the Nile, surrounded by trees, with a grand road lined with massive trees leading to the entrance, the whole structure visible from a great distance. Whether or not his superlative was accurate, the sight was clearly extraordinary. What Herodotus actually came to see was the festival, and it is worth spending a moment on what he found there, because it does not match any standard image of solemn religious ceremony. The annual festival of Bastet was, by a wide margin, the most popular festival in Egypt. Herodotus estimates that 700,000 people attended in a single year, traveling to Bubastis by boat along the Nile. He describes the journey as follows. Men and women sailed together in enormous numbers. Women carrying rattles, men playing flutes, everyone singing and clapping. When the boats passed riverside towns, women on board shouted at the women on shore, sometimes mockingly, sometimes with more explicit gestures. When they arrived at Bubastis, the city opened into days of music, dancing, sacrifice, and the consumption of more wine than was drunk in the rest of the year combined. Women, Herodotus notes with the air of a man trying to be accurate and not entirely sure how to phrase it, were freed from the usual social constraints. They danced, they drank, they made their feelings about certain things quite clear. Modern scholars connect this to the fertility aspect of Bastet's cult, and to the older tradition of appeasing lioness goddesses specifically with what Egyptian sources call feasts of drunkenness. The idea embedded in the ritual was that the wildness of the celebration mirrored the wildness of the goddess's nature, the part of her that had once been a lioness. You honored her by letting the controlled surface of ordinary life briefly crack open. The temple complex itself was also a cat cemetery. Sacred cats were kept by her priests and considered living manifestations of the goddess. When they died, they were mummified, wrapped in linen, sometimes placed in elaborately decorated bronze cat coffins, and buried at the temple. Families mourned their cats publicly, shaving off their eyebrows as a sign of grief, waiting until the mourning period was complete before resuming normal life. A farmer in Beni Hizn, who dug into a burial mound in 1888, found more than 200,000 mummified cats in a single site. Harming a cat in ancient Egypt, even accidentally, was a crime that could carry the death penalty. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus recorded witnessing a Roman citizen accidentally kill a cat in Egypt and being torn apart by a mob before any official justice could intervene. The legal system agreed with the mob. Killing a cat was that serious. When the Greeks arrived and eventually the Ptolemies took the throne, Bastet did not disappear. She merged. The Greeks identified her with Artemis, their goddess of the hunt and the moon, and the blending of the two created a slightly different divine figure, one who carried both traditions. Her temple in Alexandria, discovered by archaeologists in 2010, contained dozens of statues of Bastet, still surrounded by evidence of active worship during the Greek-ruled Ptolemaic period. She had been absorbing new influences and adapting for 3,000 years at that point. One more was not a problem. Here is what that whole arc amounts to. Bastet began as a face of the most primal force in the Egyptian world, the power that kills to protect, the solar rage that keeps chaos from winning. Over 5,000 years, without losing that foundation, she became something else too. The protector of the family dinner table, the goddess called on by a woman who wanted her children to be safe. The divine presence that meant a cat sleeping in your house was not just an animal, but a small piece of something holy keeping watch. The Egyptians did not see those two things as a contradiction. The lioness that hunts to feed her cubs and the cat that curls against a sleeping child are doing the same thing, just at different scales. Bastet held both because the Egyptians understood that ferocity and tenderness are not opposites. They are, in the right hands, the same force. 5,000 years later, a significant portion of the internet is dedicated to photographs of cats. Bastet, when suspects, is entirely unsurprised.